The other thing you tackle in Transcendent Kingdom is religion, um,
Mhm.
Christianity, or to be more specific, because this is a Pentecostal family, which
Mhm.
also is how you were in real life,
Yeah.
and the way you write about the conflict, the inherent conflict that you feel when you're associated so deeply in a faith, especially. I joke with this about other friends. I was like, black kids don't really get to pick their religion, okay? Like you are told you're gonna be
Yep.
this, and it's what it is, and so your relationship with it can sometimes be very adversarial, and
Mhm.
I certainly understand that as well. It made me curious. What is your relationship with religion now?
Adversarial is a good is a good word. I
Okay.
mean, I I also had this unique position, which is like Gifties in the book. I was raised Pentecostal, but initially, when we first came to America, we were members of what was called the African Christian Church. So it was mostly Nigerians and Ghanaians, and it felt like there was a real kind of continuity in the way that the religion had been practiced for my parents and for us, like back in Ghana, and the way that it was practiced here. And then when we moved to Alabama, by the time we moved to Alabama, we were living in Southeast Huntsville, which is the white part of town, and we were going to a predominantly white church. For most of my years there, we were the only Black family at that church. And so I think that was kind of the beginning of the end of me kind of feeling comfortable with the religious practice. Like so much of my kind of burgeoning awarenesses around race and racism are located in that church. Like it was an incredibly toxic place for me, an incredibly difficult place for me, and I couldn't reconcile the fact that the people who practice the religion are talking about love, they're talking about forgiveness, about faith, and yet here they are doing some of the most explicitly racist things that I've experienced in my life. And I just I couldn't stay. And so I left when I was 14, I think was the last time that I went to church. And it felt really, really confusing because I had been a believer before that. Like I'd been a believer for much of my life, but yeah, the way that particular that particular kind of Southern white evangelical religion was practiced just felt so at odds with how I viewed the world and what was important to me.
Did you well, were you curious about what the experience would be like, say, in a black church? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so
Okay.
curious. I mean, and I'd already had some, I'd already had glimpses of that because of the church that we'd gone to in Ohio, the African Christian church. So I knew that it wasn't specific to religion. Like I understood that there were differences, that people practiced religion differently, and I think I was starting to understand that churches are among the most racially segregated places in this country,
Especially in
but
Alabama.
especially in Alabama. And so there's a part of me that thinks about the fact that maybe I would still believe, like maybe I would still have that faith be the most important aspect of my life if I had stayed, or if I had gone to a Black church, if I had stayed with the faith but gone to a place that was more receptive of me as a person.
What did your parents think about this?
About the book or about me
No,
leaving the church?
about you leaving the church.
um, Not pleased. I mean, I should say, like, on my father, he's a professor of French language and Francophone African literature. He's like a pretty staunch post-colonialist. And even when we were going to church, he would always be kind of whispering under his breath, "We wouldn't believe this if the colonizers hadn't come." Like he was always like kind of correcting the record. So there was that. But my mother is quite devout, and has been for my entire life. And so I think it was very difficult for her to watch her children leave the faith. Yeah.
What was life like growing up in Alabama?
It was Okay. I mean, Huntsville is an interesting city. It's NASA is there. There's a military base there. There are a couple of universities there, three universities there. So it has like a lot of immigrants, a lot of intellectual life, but it is like so many cities in the South, like it is very much segregated. And so the south part of Huntsville is white, the north part of Huntsville is black. So you get this sense of that kind of lurking in the background. And it's the kind of place, like my parents would always say, like, you can never run out of gas like 20 minutes outside of Huntsville. Like you have to make sure that you've got yourself together, because the surrounding areas are still, it's still Alabama, it's still Alabama. Yeah.
And what how do you think growing up there informed how you write about race? I mean, it's not like race is in the forefront necessarily. I mean, it is in
Mm-hmm.
homegoing, but in a different way, because you're telling a different kind of story. But how do you think that experience like informed how you chose to write about race from a fiction standpoint?
Mm. I think it deeply, deeply informed it. It was the beginning for me of like thinking about race and ethnicity in kind of different contexts. Like I always say, like before we got to Alabama, I was so we lived in places that were more racially mixed. I went to schools that had other Black students in it. Like there wasn't this sense of like the starkness of the division until I got to Huntsville. So I think that was really the beginning of me starting to kind of understand race in America, because my parents aren't American and they weren't teaching me, and so I wasn't seeing it from that perspective. I think in particular for a book like Homegoing, I probably never would have written it if I had stayed in Columbus, Ohio, where we first came. Like if I had stayed in a place where I didn't feel that kind of ominousness of this legacy of the slave trade. And I think Alabama was a place that started that reckoning for me. And so to think about coming from a place, Ghana, that had this involvement in the slave trade, and then winding up in a state where the effects are still so strongly felt, like it felt like the irony of that was something I couldn't escape. So Homegoing is deeply informed by both Ghana and Alabama.
You talked earlier about how um, your Ghanaian family looked at you when you were over there.
Mm-hmm.
In America, well, overall, not just in Huntsville, but how were how would you say your experience, or how would you describe your experience as being treated as the daughter of an immigrant family, not born here? Like how did that what did that world look like for you in navigating that?
I mean, it was really hard, especially when I was younger. Particularly, I think when we left again Columbus, which had a pretty large Ghanaian immigrant community. So, like, I had friends in preschool who were also Ghanaian American. So in that way, I didn't feel my difference as much as when we started to move to places that were more homogenous. And then suddenly, you get the kind of classic immigrant stories of somebody making fun of the food that you're eating or making fun of your parents' accent. But then I was also getting this extra layer of like not really understanding how to navigate Blackness in America, because my parents weren't talking about the issues that maybe I needed them to talk about in order to understand why that person called me that name, why that person like made fun of me for saying something in that way. Like all of those nuances, I think, were really kind of lost on me in the beginning, and I had to figure out a lot on my own. My brothers and I think, had to figure out a lot for ourselves, because our parents weren't really attuned to that yet.
Yeah, because I just remember growing up. I grew up in Detroit, and
Mm,
somebody being African. Not that I recall, frankly, knowing any Africans growing up, but it was something we made fun of.
hmm
And so I'm
hmm
sure you experienced kind of a good deal of that, because we were sort of very ignorant. Our parents didn't talk to us about this is what the connection to Africa means. And so
Right.
I didn't know till I got to college. It was like, oh, okay. So then I was like, wow. And it really, kind of dawned on me about just how much, what that lack of connection, how costly it can be.
Yeah.
So you deleted all of your social media, correct?
That's true. Yeah. I
Okay.
used to have a Twitter and a
Okay.
Facebook. Yeah. And an
Okay.
Instagram.
So how long have you been social media free?
I have been social media free. I think the last thing I deleted was Instagram, which I deleted in 2018, I think. So it's
Mm-hmm.
been 3 years.
So you really are following the path of Ta-Nehisi. Because he was on it for a minute, it was like gone.
Yep.
Yeah.